Welcome to this month's podcast of Talking With, where we pull back the curtain on some of Nevada County's finest, funniest, frankest, sometimes freakiest, to see what's most of us will never get to see. And today, we pull back the curtain and look behind the glamour and the glitter of the world of law with Eric Little, a respected local attorney with specialties in a whole host of things for which we really don't have much of a care for. Things like divestitures, buy-sell agreements, data ownership, corporate government. We don't want to talk about any of that, Eric, but welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay. So anyway, I want to get started with I've heard a story from you about sort of how you got started in the law. You were a pretty well-behaved boy, and then something went wrong, and you started going to law. So give us that story from the start.
Well, I'm going to have to disagree with your premise just to get started. I'm not sure I was well-behaved, and in fact, there are a group of people that would disagree with you. I am a high school dropout because I wasn't well-behaved and earned the wrath of the headmaster, and I'm afraid I dropped out of college just before I was about to graduate. So I'm not, and there are other reasons to disagree with the premise, but in any event, I am a lawyer. I have spent part of my career, though not all of it, practicing law. I guess I got into it in part because my father, who was an engineer, said it's the lawyers that make all the decisions about things. And, being young and full of myself, thought, it'd be nice to make all the decisions about things. And, of course, he was wrong and I was wrong. I was working for a public interest law firm after having escaped college in Washington, D.C., and thought, well, gee, maybe I should go to law school. Here I am working for a public interest law firm. I'm in D.C. There are a couple of good law schools in D.C. So I talked my way into Georgetown Law School at night, and one thing led to another, and it stuck, and I went to the day division, and then started working at the Securities Exchange Commission. And lo and behold, pretty soon I was a lawyer.
So I want to know, what kept you going on all those lonely days reading cases and briefs and trying to get through law school?
Oh, law school is the very best part of being a lawyer. Absolutely. The rest of being a lawyer has got a significant component of drudgery. But let me tell you what, and it's really funny you should ask what kept me going, because at Georgetown, they assigned a case to incoming law students before the first class ever started. And the case they assigned was about conversion of a pile of horse manure. It was a case from Stamford, Connecticut in the 1870s. And some farmer had a bunch of his hands sweep up the horse manure in the town square. And they did it late in the evening, and then they left these 6 big piles of horse manure. One can only imagine what the town square was like in those days. But they left these big piles of horse manure in the town square. And the next morning, another farmer comes along and sees all these piles of horse manure and says, "Woo, whoopee, this is my day." And he loaded them into a cart and trucked them off to his farm. And since they were worth the grand sum of $1 a pile, the first farmer sued the second. And this was a case before the Connecticut Supreme Court, who awarded damages to the fellow who's swept up all the manure and thereby exerted ownership of it. And interestingly enough, I expect to refer to that case in the talk on AI and the law in a month or two. But to get to what kept me interested in law school, I mean, just look at that case. Look at the facts. You can really see the conflict. You can see, the sweaty farmers, the sweaty farmhands thinking, it's, the sun's gone down. It's enough for a day. I'll come back and take care of it in this morning. And you can see this other farmer who got up with the chickens, going into town on some errand and say, "Hey, look at all this." Nobody around, he asked, and carted it off, and then didn't want to pay the $6, which must have been quite a sum of money in those days, enough to have a lawsuit about. So, as you read the cases, you get to see the real conflict that occurs. And in many of these, I would say most cases, there are strong motivations on each side. There's something personal at stake for each party, even if it's two large corporations. There's people in those companies whose reputation relies on what they did, and they had good reasons for doing it. And so you get to see the conflict. And so that's what law school is. It's a lot of fun. And then you go and become a young associate at a very large firm where everything is deadly dull and boring.
So you make it through law school and you go to work for the Securities Exchange, right?
That's correct.
And that's an interesting place because that's a very particular part of law.
Well, it was. But, when I was in law school, it was sort of everybody wanted to be a securities lawyer because those were the people that made the most money and had the most respect. And it was considered to be, in some areas, I'm sure it still is, the apex of the profession. So I got a pretty interesting job at the headquarters, working in the Department of Market Regulation and Trading Practices, which again had its own interest. And it's what made me a Republican, although I didn't realize it till about 40 years later. That is, I didn't become a Republican, but it traces back to that. I became very skeptical of the motivations of government resulting from that experience. But after about a year and a half, there's a lot of turnover as people go up and become partners at Wall Street firms. And so one of the guys I was working for went up, and I stuck my thumb out and hitched a ride and wound up working literally on Wall Street. So I can actually say I have been a Wall Street lawyer. So that was a lot of fun.
Goodness gracious.
In its own way.
Little did we know that right here in Nevada County, on East Main Street, lives an attorney that worked on Wall Street. So let me ask you a question. Did there come a point along this journey where some historical figure may have prompted you to find the world of law? I mean, maybe somebody like, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln or Alfred E. Newman, I don't know. No big historical figures.
I took a course, one course on the Supreme Court in college, but I wouldn't say that. I would say maybe that the law school, and to a much lesser extent practicing law, appeals to some part of my personality, and that and disagrees with other parts of my personality to a very high degree. I'm afraid I can't point to anybody like that.
Gosh, and I was hoping you were going to point to some historical character and give us a great. But what makes these stories of Talking With so interesting is they're about real people in the real world, and not, it may not always be noble, may be interesting. So you made a reference earlier on about speaking about AI. It's a subject that is everywhere these days, maybe even too much so, I'm not sure. But there's a lot of conversation. There's going to be a meeting about that in a few weeks, and I've asked you to speak on the legal aspects of AI. Without giving it all away, what would you tell people that would intrigue them to come to our workshop?
Sure, I can say something about that. So as I've spent a lot of time on this topic, starting really from ground zero, but it generally relates to what I do, but it's pretty fascinating. And if you go out and talk to people that are really spend a lot of time with this, like Leo, who's going to also give a talk at the same event. And Leo's a client of mine. He's the CEO of Ladris. And his attitude is that it's arguably the most transformative thing since the invention of the printing press. And actually, some of the issues that it raises go back to the invention of the printing press, and the notion of copyright, what copyright is all something that, that's something that got started really as a result of the inventing of the printing press. And there was a great deal of legal turmoil and false starts. And, for over a century after the inventing of the printing press, maybe arguably 2 centuries, there was nothing like copyright that we know of today, to the extent that as a right of the author to control and derive income from making copies of his books or his writings. Instead, what there was the Society of Stationers. I probably mangle this word, not well used these days. But these were the people that printed the books. And to the extent that copyright really existed, the right to make copies was granted really by the Crown and the Parliament to the printers, not the authors. And it took a long time for that to until shortly before the U.S. Constitution, to really, short in historical terms, become a right of a right of authors. And I think, and there was a lot of legal turmoil around it. The Crown used this notion of copyright and the church as a way to control dissent, as a way to avoid not only heresy, but objections to the actions of the government. And I think you're starting to see the same level of turmoil and the same interests of the state in some of the regulation that's being proposed for AI. So, if one draws a technical analogy to the impact of the printing press and the impact of AI, I think it's also possible that there are some similarities that arise out of the magnitude of that impact in terms of how these technologies upset the existing legal arrangements and the existing laws and understanding of those laws and concepts.
Fascinating. Well, it ought to be a great program. I want to go back a little bit. You just talked about certain events that have taken place that have altered the way we conduct ourselves as human beings. In the terms of law, have there been sort of monumental points along the continuum where law has changed? Or does it all filter back to the Old Testament?
Oh, excuse me. Yeah, there are many such events, and I'm not the right person to list them all, or even a small portion of them. But the law, we think of and we count on the law to be static, because society, businessmen, individuals need certainty when they take action as to what the results of those actions are going to be. It permeates the structure of society in more ways than we normally consciously realize. But that said, it changes, and I saw this myself. So I took the bar back I probably took the D.C. bar back in 1973, the New York bar in 1974, and I practiced a while in Manhattan for a while, and then being young and full of myself, I started a software company, building software for law firms. And I did that for about 15 years until 2000, when things went belly up a little bit and I had to go back and practice law. And since at that time I was in California, not New York or D.C., I had to take the California California bar. And lo and behold, the law had changed on me. But, slowly over time, but 30 years was enough that I had to go back, take another bar review course and, learn the new stuff. It wasn't just moving from, New York to California. It was, in fact, a lot of, things around federal law had changed. And that was, these days, everybody thinks that, legal changes flow from the Supreme Court. There's a lot of brouhaha about that. But it's really a two-way street. The culture changes over time, and that changes how the justices think about things and pursue things. And it's really an interplay. It's not just one way. And there have been great changes, in the past 50 years in the culture. And those are gradually reflected in the law.
Great. What else would you like to tell us about who is Eric Little and how did he get to be here? And rumor has it that you're a published author. And I have to confess, for full transparency's sake, I've actually read your work, No Other Corsican. An interesting work in science fiction, an area which I heretofore had no knowledge or information about. How in the world does an attorney write a book about that subject?
With more difficulty than most people. The reason I became a writer was I was living and working in the Bay Area for a large law firm, and I had a series of health issues that suggested I might have to spend a long time in bed, so I figured I needed a hobby I could do in bed. And I thought, well, I've read far too much science fiction, so I'll write a sci-fi book. But then I quickly discovered that it's really hard for a lawyer to write fiction. Our style is different, doesn't come naturally, so I started taking writing courses at Stanford in the evening over a couple of years. And, with that and enough diligence, I kind of learned how to write all over again a second time.
Has it helped any in terms of writing for your law business?
Yes, it definitely has. It has definitely helped. I think I brought some things from practicing law, like a focus on clarity, and that certainly influenced my literary style. And then my literary style sort of has helped as a lot of what lawyers do is derivative. They just incorporate what's been written before. But when I have, and that's by far the right thing and the easiest thing to do, but when I start with something from scratch, there's a focus on words and a focus on sentence construction that wasn't there before.
Interesting. Well, you've had a fascinating career, a fascinating history. We're so pleased to have you in Nevada County and part of the community. And I just want to personally thank you for all that you've done for the Economic Resource Council over the years and how you've helped some young people in our community get started. And perhaps next time around we can talk about some of those. But for today, we'll call it a wrap. And I just want to say thank you to Eric Little for pulling the curtain back on who in the heck this guy is. So thank you much, and listen next month to Talking With. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.